Dear Birmingham. That doesn't even sound right. Yo, Brum. That's the kind of thing that I would write. That's not because you're not dear to me or always here for me, but I have heard your bark and more than once I felt your bite. So how you keeping?
This is the Epic Brum podcast, and that was the voice of Birmingham's very own Poet Laureate, Casey Bailey. Casey's a writer, educator and spoken word artist from Nechells in Birmingham. He's earned great admiration in his home city. It's led to him being commissioned to write poetry for high-profile Birmingham institutions such as Town Hall Symphony Hall and the Peaky Blinders. Casey joined us on the podcast just a few weeks after being named as Birmingham's Poet Laureate for 2020 to 2022. Casey, welcome to the Epic Brum podcast. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. Thank you for having me.
No, it's great. It's really, really good to have your time because, I mean, some people may or may not know that your day job, you're a school teacher, and at the time of recording, you're meant to be on half term, but I saw the picture you put up on Twitter the other day of your little schedule, and it looked pretty jam-packed, so not much of a holiday for you this week.
No, and I have quite a lot to do for work as well, actually, that I've just got to get ready for when we go back, so it's no rest.
Busy boy, yeah. So congratulations are in order anyway, because you've just recently been named as Birmingham's Poet Laureate for 2020 to 2022. It was announced on National Poetry Day. And I know most people will have heard of the Poet Laureate and they've got a vague idea of what it means or what they think it means. But do you want to just give us a little flavour of what it's going to entail?
Yeah, I think it's what I'm beginning to find out is it's quite self-led. So in many ways, there's not like a set thing that a Birmingham Poet Laureate does. There's not like a program, or there's not like a leadership structure where someone will directly be saying, "We need you to do this." But for me, it's always, I applied for the Birmingham Poet Laureate 2 years ago as well, and it's always been about promoting poetry in Birmingham and promoting Birmingham through poetry. And so that's what hopefully I'll be trying to do, and making sure that communities that don't always feel like they can access poetry and feel like poetry is for them are made to feel like they are part of what is a really rich scene in Birmingham. And then, of course, expanding the name and adding some prestige to the name of Birmingham poetry outside of the city.
Sure. So in some ways, it is kind of like a civic role, but you've kind of been doing that unofficially anyway, because you've been commissioned by Combined Authority, the Chamber of Commerce, Town Hall Symphony Hall, and loads of like big institutions. So it's kind of not formalising it, but it's a bit of a badge to what you've kind of been doing anyway, isn't it?
Yeah, I guess so. And in the interview, one of the people on the interview said to me, when I asked, what does being the Poet Laureate entail? They said, well, a bit tongue in cheek, but a lot of what you've been doing and a lot of the stuff that I had been doing in the last 2 years, you would have normally expected the Poet Laureate to be doing some of those things anyway. So it's good to be to have that title and feel like I can say to the scene as a whole, or to people outside the scene, poetry is for you, or maybe we do need to consider this and ask questions and hopefully provide answers as well.
Yeah, as you said, you've spoken about wanting to make poetry more accessible, if you like, and take it to parts of the parts of the city where it perhaps hasn't resonated before. So I guess it's a platform to inspire a bit of change in that respect.
That's the plan, yeah. And I think that poetry is all over the city, but how much people feel like that their poetry holds the value that it really does and should be listened to, as we know it should, is questionable, and it's different in different parts of the city. And I want everyone to feel like what they're doing is as valuable and as valid as each other.
You've just done one for I Choose Birmingham, haven't you? The sort of culture magazine. So what was the inspiration behind that?
It was a really interesting one because Tom at I Choose Birmingham got in touch with me and asked if I could write something, and a very busy period of time, and I said to him, in all honesty, I'm not sure, but I'll try and put together something short. And just weirdly, I just sat down to write it, and there was just a whole poem in there that I needed to get out anyway, I think. Um, and so I touched on where I grew up. I touched on the places that I frequented when I grew up. I touched on friends that I've lost, and yeah, it just all kind of came together from that request, really.
Yeah, we're gonna. I was going to ask you actually a bit later on, get onto some of the themes that come across in your work, but something I found quite telling in relation to the subject of making poetry more accessible is, you are a Nechells boy,
Hmm.
but I read an interview where you said there are more white middle class people in Birmingham that know who you are and about what you do than those who come from where you grew up, and I found that quite a telling statement. And I guess that's part of the challenge that you've already mentioned, isn't it?
Absolutely, and I think that um, if people who listen to my poetry, people who read my poetry, and people who listen to me speak know that that doesn't come out of a place of me reaching out for that audience. I write poetry that's true to who I am, where I've been. But ultimately, I think the barrier comes into people from where I come from often don't see poetry as being for them. And some of that is, and or they don't feel like they're allowed to openly accept and appreciate poetry. And I think some of that comes from within the community, and some of that comes from the way in which poetry is presented. When I think about how poetry was presented to me in school, it definitely wasn't for a little mixed race boy growing up in Nechells. That definitely wasn't what I was getting from that. And I think that's a shame because there are so many poets, working class poets, black poets, female poets, uh, disabled poets who are potentially representing a group of people who don't feel the same, who don't feel like they can access the space. And it would be great if more of those people felt like that door was open for them.
I think it's something a lot of people are guilty of with all forms of art, actually, where they
Hmm.
perhaps pigeonhole something that it's got a more broader meaning and more depth to it than the way it's badged, so to speak.
Absolutely.
But so we've talked a bit about the now and the poet laureate role, and it's going to be really exciting to see you put your stamp on that over the next 2 years. But I wanted to take you back to the start, really. So as we said, you grew up in Nechells, and I know that your observations of some of the issues facing that part of the city and other parts of Birmingham are kind of consistent in your work, and you do sort of tackle those head on. So can you paint a picture for us a little bit of young Casey growing up in Nechells and how it shaped you, and then from that how poetry and the spoken word became something that you ended up throwing yourself into?
Um, yeah, young Casey. What a tearaway. Um, I was so actually I say that a bit tongue in cheek, but actually between the ages of maybe as soon as I became aware of my environment and some of the potential pitfalls, up until the age of about 14, I was very kind of consciously um, guarded against falling into some of the issues that I'd seen my peers and family members fall into. And I think that comes from the fact that I was raised by a dad who was very strict, very honest, and very wise. And I was raised by a mother who was extremely loving, and had 100% belief in her kids. And so for me, there was no need to become a part of um, these kind of groups of people who potentially were banding together because they needed belonging, banding together because they didn't necessarily feel like they were getting that level of love or community from anywhere else. But at the same time, these people were my friends. I was still very much friends with people who were getting into issues and getting into problems. And I definitely spiraled for a few years into the midst of those issues, and was fully involving myself in things that I'd never had any business. Nobody has any business involving themselves in. And for me, I think the writing started when I was about 15 years old. I was writing lyrics, and my plan was always to reflect the environment that I was in. So even when I first started writing, that was always the intention. I think what I realized as I got a bit older is I was actually adding to the negativity around me. So there were young people who I think of one specific instant, and it springs to my mind as the reason. I've always known it's the reason I stopped rapping for a very long time. Is that I made a song, and a young boy who I knew had got himself into some trouble, and I kind of pulled him to one side. I was like, "What are you thinking? Like, what are you doing?" And I said, "It's like you say in your song." And he quoted one of my lyrics back to me as the reason he'd made this like really bad decision, and that's when I became acutely aware of the real power of words, and and it kind of started to shape how I wanted to use them. Definitely.
So that could have had a detrimental effect then in that respect.
It absolutely did have a detrimental effect, and I have to be very honest about that. And um, I know that was an instance um, that was made apparent to me, and it gives me no pride to say I'm conscious that there were probably more people who had heard some of the stuff that I'd said and took it as I don't know how best to put it, took it as a I can't remember the word. There's a specific word I'm thinking of, but I can't remember what it is. Poet laureate, apparently. Um, took it as this is the wrong word, but it does the job. It took it as an endorsement of that lifestyle. Took it as someone saying, yeah, that we should be doing certain things that we shouldn't be doing. And I think I lost myself in trying to say this is what's happening. And I definitely went down the route that a lot of young inner city rappers go down of sometimes purposefully, sometimes accidentally glorifying what is a lifestyle with no glory. Um, and when I became aware of that, I genuinely couldn't rap for a while. It felt quite a heavy burden to think about what I had actually potentially done with those words.
You talked about there the terms you used. Actually, started writing lyrics, and you mentioned rapping. So it was all it started out as kind of a musical passion, so to speak. Or is
Yeah,
that
absolutely.
was that by design, and then you just kind of fell into poetry
I think
later on?
yeah, I think I've always had a passion for music, but I'm not a I'm not a musically skilled person. So, given all the time and resources in the world, I would not be making I would not be making music. I write the lyrics and I sit on top of the music. I started writing poetry because I didn't. So as I said, I didn't write for a long time. I went to university, and very long story short, I qualified to be a teacher, and there were a group of students who, um, predominantly boys, who were not engaging with English at all, not engaging with literacy. And I literally overheard a conversation between a member of English staff and a senior member of staff about these kids. And I said, "Can I run a group for them?" And I'll just start getting them to write and getting them to think about um, the techniques that they're kind of failing to access in English. And I started a group called Bailey's Rap and Poetry, the acronym BRAP. Um, and and then the kids started challenging me to write. So I would say to them, next week I want a poem about this, or I want to rap about this. And they started saying, well, sir, next week we want you to do a rap about this, or we want you to write a poem about this. And so I started writing again and kind of reinvigorated my passion for it.
Yeah, I was going to ask you actually that. How does a young person pursue a passion for something like poetry and the spoken word? Because if you're a musician, there are venues and there are promoters who can help you and so on and so forth. If theatre's your form of expression, you've got Amdram groups. If you're a dancer, there's dance groups, etc. So how does a poet or a spoken word artist pursue that passion?
This is a great question, and I'm working with some of the like current kind of leading poets from and of the city um, to answer it in some respects. But there are poetry writing groups. So there is a poetry writing group that I mean currently I'm sure it's online, but normally it's every 2 weeks at Birmingham Hippodrome called Poets Place, led by a poet called Jasmine Gardosi, who's just a phenomenal poet and an extraordinary facilitator. And there are a number of small community groups, and one of the things that I want to do as a poet laureate is grow these places and provide space for more opportunities, because there are loads of nights. There are lots of opportunities to come and perform in Birmingham, but just that development is something that we do need to work on.
Yeah, because the cultural scene in Birmingham, notwithstanding the small matter of a pandemic, it's great whether you're a musician or you're into the arts or you're a creative or you're into food or whatever. So it'd be a shame if poetry didn't or wasn't sort of firmly part of that mix.
And I think, and this is, and again, this is the thing about bringing poetry to people, because poetry absolutely is. We have some huge poetry nights: Hit the Ode, Poetry Jam, Sturchley Speaks, Spoken Trend. We have. I run a night called Ramblers Ball, which is quarterly, but we have regular poetry nights. And if you go to Poetry Jam on the first Thursday of the month, when we don't have a pandemic, you'll find more people in there than you'll find at the average local music gig. Absolutely,
Yeah.
it's rammed. So it's definitely there.
How old were you then when you wrote your first poetry piece, so to speak?
I wrote some poetry when I was in school, but I divide the two sections of my life. I think the first thing that I wrote, like that, at the time I thought I was taking it seriously. I'd hate to read it back. Would have been around 2011, 12. So I'd have been early 20s.
Okay, but what about the first one where you thought, oh, hang on, I've cracked this. I'm onto something here.
Oh, trust me, Dan. I thought I'd cracked it then, but I was very, very wrong. No, to be fair, at the time, it was well received. I was going to poetry nights, and I was building a reputation in the city as a poet. So I think I'm quite harsh on it. And I spoke to a very talented poet called Anne Gill, who did creative writing at the University of Birmingham very recently, about my feelings about my old poetry, and she said that just means you're getting better, Casey. You'd hate to stay in the same place. So I'll take that. But yeah, so I would say then was, for me at the time, I thought, yeah, this is it. Like, I'm a poet. Like, this is what I do.
Yeah. Do you talk to your students about poetry a lot in terms of? I mean, well, I think back to when I was at school, and it was difficult to have an open dialogue with teachers about arty things, especially something that some people poetry would be deemed as niche to a lot of kids, and they just wouldn't be, if you had a hobby like that, it wouldn't be that. They'd be reticent to have a kind of open
Yeah.
dialogue. So what are your students like? Do they look at your work? They watch your videos and things like that, and then talk to you about them? And
Some, not masses, and I think at the so I've recently moved school. I say recently, I started teaching at my current school last year September, but obviously with the pandemic in the middle of all that, it still feels very recent. So at my previous school, the students were much more aware. I'm just starting a creative writing group for the Academy Trust that I work at. So I love um, to talk about poetry, and I love to talk about all forms of creativity. And people often say to me, Casey, people must think you're really cool, or your students must think you're really cool. And I'm a teacher, and I teach maths, and I write poems. And if you could think of a cocktail of things that would make you less cool to a group of young people, then I challenge you to come up with it. But
could be
I
a geography teacher. That's not as
smashed
cool
it.
as.
That's the one. That's the only thing I could have done to take it further. No, but I think for me, I like to talk. For me, teaching has always been about the people more than it has been about the subjects, and so I kind of relish the times around teaching where I can talk to students, get to know them, get to know who they are and what they do. So at my previous school, there was definitely you'd probably say there were more kids there writing poetry, openly talking about it and comparing notes, and being visible in that kind of space than you'd normally find. And I think that is in part due to the fact that I was there talking to them about their poetry. I would get them to bring their poetry to me, and I'd have a look at it. When I published my first full collection, Adjusted, with Verve Poetry Press, the publisher asked me to have three other poets that I kind of saw as like the future, like the next generation of poets, and one of those was one of my students. Um, So yeah, it's definitely something I like to talk to them about, because I think if there's an interest in it, then it's something we should make space to talk about. And I often think there's not an interest in it because people haven't, discussed it in a way that they find interesting. I'm still trying to talk to people who might think it's not for them.
That must be an incredible feeling, though, to have had one of your former pupils name checked in that way, and you to think you might have played some role in inspiring them as well.
Absolutely. And for me, that is, teaching is the most rewarding thing I've ever done. I think it's probably the most rewarding thing in the world. But I knew that when I started teaching, and I knew that on a day to day basis. But when it really hit home for me is when, people I've taught have reached out for me and said, "Oh, Mr. Bailey, just so you know, I'm just about to start my teacher training because I want to try and have the impact on people that you had on me." And I'm like welling up, like, "Oh my god, like how did this happen? Did I do this?" And that's huge. Like I can't really put into words. And people have found me out online and messaged me to say, sir, when you spoke to me about this when I was in year 10, I was at the lowest point in my life and you helped me to get through it. You just can't, I can't put a value on that. So yeah, it's amazing.
Wow! So you've inspired them. Who inspired you? Were there any poets in particular that you took an interest in when you were younger, or when you kind of starting to establish yourself?
I think to be honest, more, and this is probably why I say that my poetry. I think my poetry wasn't very good when I started writing poetry, because I hadn't really fully engaged with poetry at the time. So I was writing like kind of like riffs off hip hop lyrics. So it was very rhyme driven. It was very much about trying to be clever and witty, um, and didn't really have the kind of depth that I'd like to think my writing has now. And so I think I became influenced more once I started writing. And there's poets in Birmingham like Bogdan Piasecki. There's poets like Amira Saleh. There's um, poets like Leon Priestnell, who are just phenomenal poets, and also like just have a wealth of knowledge. So those three people I've spoke about there, every time I spoke to them, I had to go away and look something up because they just knew so much, and they would talk about things that I knew nothing about, like everybody knew it, and I found it really captivating and magical. Um, and then I started finding poets like Raymond Antrobus and Caleb Femi. I started finding poets like Selena Godden, Vanessa Kasule, and that for me drove me to want to know more and to be better and to read more and to listen more. So yeah, I kind of, my inspiration in terms of poetry kind of weirdly came after I'd started writing poetry.
And there's always more, isn't there, that you discover along the way. That's the beauty with.
Absolutely.
So you had your early works, and then but I suppose it's one thing. It's becoming prolific at it and developing a bit of a collection. And as you've mentioned already, you released Adjusted, which was a book of your work, and it came out. Was it 2018?
Yeah, yeah. So I wrote a book. So I put together a collection, a short collection in 2017 called "Waiting at Bloomsbury Park," and I released it through a publishing method, essentially called hybrid publishing, with a publisher from Nottingham called Big White Shed, who are just amazing. And so some of the poetry in that would have been just some of my earlier poetry, but even that, it came out in 2017, and the poems were like 2016 and 2017. Um, and then I spoke to Stuart Bartholomew from Verve, and he wanted at the time. So Verve were about to release they're about to launch as a press, and he wanted me to take the poems from Waiting in Bloomsbury Park and add kind of like double the amount again and release it as like a new collection. But I felt a bit awkward. I felt a bit cheeky about that because I felt like if somebody came and bought my book and went home and went, hold on, I've got half of this book already. Yeah, they feel like I ripped them off. So the poems in progression, almost exclusively were written between early 2017 and early 2018.
The synopsis on the book says, Casey's poems should break under the weight of the joy they contain and the grief they depict, which kind of suggests it's full of quite extreme highs and massive lows as well. Is that accurate? Or
Yeah, absolutely. I had this weird thing where I read the book at Sturchley Speaks, and I have this really weird thing. So I write poetry. It also happens when I read other people's work in my head compared to when I read it to other people. And when I read it at Sturchley Speaks, I just became acutely aware of how sad it was in a lot of parts. And I do have a bit of a reputation of being the happiest poet, with the saddest poems, um, which I'm not worried about. I'm quite happy with that reputation. It's fine. But but yeah, there are some extreme lows in there, but there are definitely some real moments of joy. And I guess that's life as I've known it.
you mentioned Verve Poetry, who are they're Birmingham based, aren't they? And it seems like they've got a really good stable of poets.
Verve have got some phenomenal poets, and I think that the way that Verve operate and the talent that they promote from the region and the talent that they bring to the region is amazing. So yeah, you can never say enough good things about Verve.
Sure, you've mentioned a few people that whose work you really admire, but you also meet and perform alongside a lot of other spoken word artists who
Yeah.
a lot of us won't be familiar with. So, is there anyone you want to tell us about or give a quick shout out to who you admire and you'd recommend that people go and check out?
Oh wow, yeah, there are loads. Hannah Swings from Birmingham. Hannah Swings is just an absolutely phenomenal poet who writes some gorgeous poetry, and he's great to watch. She has just an amazing kind of presence on stage. So yeah, Hannah Swings definitely. Jasmine Gardosi, in my opinion, is the standout performance poet in the country. She's extraordinary. She's from Birmingham as well. Adrian B. Earl is another Birmingham poet. And I think I definitely have to say, if you get the chance, go and see Jamie Thrasavulu from Derby. Jamie Thrasavulu is an absolute whirlwind of poetry, and yeah, he's just amazing. So yeah.
Fantastic. Some great names to look out for there then. We're going to get on to talking about Birmingham in a minute as a city and some of your favourite things about it. But I think a natural segue into that would be to touch on a couple of your best known pieces. And the obvious one to start with is Dear Birmingham.
Mm-hmm. House Mountain or the Fountain Lane under Brum, I promise. I will stay around like the Rotunda. I don't need 10 letters. You know that ain't me. You know I spell Birmingham, Home. So wherever I may be, I will carry your thoughts with me. Forever yours. Mister, I'm in love with my city.
It's I've listened or watched it on YouTube a few times, and it's very deep, and it kind of feels like it's a piece of two halves, really.
Mm.
You're venting your frustrations, Brum, I love you, but at times you feel like you've betrayed me. And it mentions Charlene Ellis and Letitia Shakespeare
Mm-hmm.
and what tragically happened to them. It mentions the collapse of Rover. It mentions Cadbury selling out to America, and then it goes into the second half, and you remind us that it's still like the birthplace of your dreams, and you talk about being inspired by walking along the canals. So it's kind of, as I say, a poem of two halves, and it's quite bittersweet. Is that fair to say?
Absolutely, yeah. I think that is the best way to sum it up. It's very bittersweet. And so I wrote that poem for, there was a show that was happening at the time called 10 Letters, and another kind of Birmingham icon of poetry, Spos, had asked me to be involved. And I really ummed and ahed over it for ages, and I almost wrote a letter that was like an Ofsted letter to Birmingham. I'm so glad I never did that. What a ridiculous idea that was. But in the end, I got stuck because I was writing something really nice, and I thought it feels too nice. And then I was writing something that was quite, I think, angry would probably be the best way to say it, and it felt too angry. And in my head, the way I got around it is I thought I need to think about Birmingham like my older brother, and I absolutely love my older brother. And he's like a hero in my life. But sometimes he used to punch me in the ribs really hard, and I couldn't breathe for ages. And so, and so Birmingham has these, it has my love and my adulation, but at the same time, it's given me a few gut punches. And so that was kind of my mindset when I wrote the poem.
That's a fantastic analogy, by the way. I'm sure anybody who's got an older sibling will probably tell you. Then the other one that I think a lot of people will be familiar with for obvious reasons was the Ballad of the Peaky Blinders, which the BBC, I think they used it ahead of season 5 of the
They
show,
did. Yeah, yeah.
and it was a bit of a recap with your words of what had happened so far in the first 4 seasons. And there's a great video of you with footage from the show
Mhm.
interspersed. And so, how did that come about? Did it come from the BBC, or did it come from Stephen Knight, or how did it
So yeah,
happen?
it's an interesting one because I'd met Stephen Knight on 2 occasions before it came about. I met him when Birmingham bid to bring Channel 4 to the Midlands, and I met him in France. I was performing for the West Midlands Combined Authority in Cannes, and he was
Mippim.
there at MIPIM, yeah, and he introduced me to the stage. I just think back 10 years. Stephen Knight, the writer of the Peaky Blinders, introduced me on the stage in Cannes to perform my poetry. It's all a bit surreal. And so we spoke then again. And so when I got the call, I presumed that he had said something or put the ball in motion. And so when I said that to the woman who called me is called Carrie, absolutely like amazing producer and just a legendary person. Um, and I said, "Oh, was this kind of come through Stephen Knight?" She said, "No, what do you mean?" And I was like, "Because I've met Stephen Knight and he's seen me do some poetry." And she said, "Oh, no, no, we've just found your stuff." Um, and I remember saying probably one of the most exciting moments of the whole thing is I said, "Well, what other poets are you considering for this?" Because normally you have a commission in mind, you want a poem written, and you start thinking about who you might want to write it, or you open up an applications process. And she said, we've only got you in mind because we didn't want a poem and then come to you. We saw your work and then decided we needed a poem like from you. And I was like, oh wow, for the Peaky Blinders. And I remember seeing the finished thing with the full BBC overlay and all the words and lettering and everything. I was just mind blown. So yeah, they just called me up and said, do you want to write us this poem for the Peaky Blinders? Yes. Yes, I do,
Wow.
actually.
They do have a great eye or ear for stuff like this, actually, the BBC, because I remember when, just digressing slightly, when I worked for Aston Villa, Villa were playing West Brom in a big local derby, an FA
Mm,
Cup quarter final, and they did a similar kind of trailer for their coverage for the game, and they used Benjamin Zephaniah,
amazing.
and it had that same kind of power behind it. And as I say, it shows they do have somebody out there is doing their research and their
Yeah.
homework. But just wanted to ask about the creative process then for something like the Ballad of the Peaky Blinder, because you're used to writing, channeling your own thoughts, I guess. But then I guess you're then taking on writing about a very specific subject with a distinctive set of characters
Yeah.
that's 4 seasons in that people are already familiar with and invested in as well.
Yeah, I think writing commissions is one of my favorite things to do. Because I was going to say something really stupid then. I was going to say I could write about anything. I'm sure I couldn't. But I feel like there is a skill to writing which is connected to the emotion behind what you write, but it's not kind of like inextricably linked. It's not something that doesn't stand on its own. um, and I always find this at work. People say to me, like, my emails, that email was very well written, Casey. And I think, yeah, because I like to write things. And so I love people saying to me, oh, could you write us a poem about this? Could you write us a poem about that? Because it just gets my gears turning in a totally different way. And the Peaky Blinders, I'm a huge, huge, huge fan. And so as soon as it was said, and I got kind of like 4 or 5 key points that they wanted mentioning, and a mood that they had in mind. As soon as I got that, I was like, it just came to me really naturally, because it's something that I do know. It's just not something that I would normally choose to write about. And so yeah, it was really fun. And there are elements, little small elements of it that are very much me. Like if somebody else had written it, they would not have written, catch the gang at the garrison. They wouldn't probably not have gone for that kind of turn of phrase. So yeah, it was a really good process. I really enjoyed writing it.
But now you've explained what you've said about how the BBC had they discovered you and they'd really done their homework on your style. That it makes sense now, because I think that if you were a bit of a sort of happy clapper poet,
Yeah,
for want of a better phrase, then that gig wouldn't have been a good fit for you, would it?
absolutely. Yeah. And I think also I'm not. I don't write in a very abstract way. So sometimes I might use kind of abstract phrases or a little bit of a segue or a little bit of a tangent with a metaphor. But I tend to be quite direct in the way that I write, which I think they needed. They didn't want somebody to turn the Shelbys into a forest and speak about how they grew like trees and then John fell. They wanted someone to give them the direct kind of thing. And I think the other thing that I like about commissions is often when I write, I have no idea where it's going. So I start writing, coming up with ideas, and I get to the end of what might be the end of the poem, and I'm like, I didn't realize that that's what I needed to write about. Whereas with a commission, it's like they say, I need you to write about this, and I say, okay, I kind of know where this is going now,
Yeah,
which is helpful.
yeah. Did you have to kind of go and recap some of the show to?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'd already watched all the series to that point, but I wanted some key kind of markers. And so I looked up, I went on YouTube and just top 10 Peaky Blinder lines. So the opening line, how many fathers and how many sons? There's an Alfie Solomon's quote where he says, how many fathers and how many sons have you cut, killed, and murdered? So that how many fathers and how many sons came from there and then went off in a different direction. There's another line, we're all whores, we just sell different parts of ourselves, which is a line that Grace says directly to Tommy. We're all whores, Tommy, we just sell different parts of ourselves. And so some of those lines I either manipulated or just took straight in and then twisted, pivoted from.
And really brought some of the characters into it as well, which is,
Yeah, that was the plan.
speaking of your commissions, I really enjoyed the Town Hall Symphony Hall one, actually, which is a completely different
Yeah,
tone. Was it making an entrance?
making an entrance. Yeah,
Yeah, and it was beautifully shot as well.
it was amazing.
The city at night time, the lights twinkling away in the background, and some of the sort of landmark buildings, and it
Yeah,
was just that. What that is a great advert for Birmingham. I know you talked about the love hate relationship and the Big Brother analogy, but that
yeah,
really was a way to show the city at its best.
absolutely. And I remember going to film it. I literally thought I was going to show up, face to camera, down the barrel, read the poem, and go home. And it was like super late. So it was after work, hence why I was dressed for work. And and I remember I showed up, and the cameraman was there, Ollie, and he said, "Right, so we've got five." And he had like a hoverboard, like a Segway under his arm, backpack on, full of camera equipment, and he said, right, so we've got 5 locations, and my first thought, and it was cold, and my first thought was, oh man, I'm going to be here all night. And as we went through and he spoke about his vision and why we were at different locations, and so much thought went into that process. And I just felt like, actually, I've written something and someone has read it and listened to it and gone, how can we now capture the visual that does that justice? And it was just, when I saw the final thing, it was amazing.
Yeah, I'd thoroughly recommend anyone who's listening who hasn't seen it to go on and watch that. And I think watching it back now, it's over a year old, isn't it?
Yeah.
But watching it back now, given what the arts and culture sector is going through, it feels quite poignant as
Yeah.
well today. Just wanted to finish off really with a few general questions about Birmingham. As someone who's written a lot about the city, what makes you most proud about Birmingham or being from Birmingham?
I think I don't know if this is just like everyone feels like it about where they're from. I don't know, but I think for me, Birmingham, it's a place where very different, and I think Nechells epitomizes this within the city. It's a place where different people from different walks of life and backgrounds can kind of coexist. And I don't think that there's always parity and equality, and I think that's probably true of everywhere in the country. But I do think there is in most parts of Birmingham and at most times there's a real mutual respect for each other. That I love. I really love that about the city.
Sure, and we've talked a lot. A lot's been said about the transformation the city, particularly the city centre's undergone over the last few years. So, what excites you about Birmingham as it is now?
I think for me, I think what I love about Birmingham, which I don't know, I might be slightly dodging your question, but I don't think so. I think what I love about Birmingham is the way that you have the town hall sitting right next to number one Chamberlain Square, leading through to the new library, but then you back onto Brindley Place where you've got the canals that have been here before everything else was here. The way that the council house sits with skyscrapers around it. I think that kind of marriage in Birmingham of the old and the new is beautiful. And I always say about Birmingham that, people go to Rome or go to Athens and they stop and spend, minutes taking photographs of buildings. And they're better buildings in Birmingham, and they walk past them every day on the way to work. And you walk past a town hall every single day, but will stop for that Rome in Athens for that picture in Athens to take the photograph. And I just think that we have a beautiful mix of the new and the old. And the old still looks so beautiful in Birmingham.
I can feel a tourist board commission coming on here, but it's been beautifully put though. And we talked about the culture and the whole cultural scene really, and as we said, if you love music, if you love food, if you love theatre, if you love the arts, and all these things, and of course poetry. I wondered what's your favourite venue or place that you've performed at in Birmingham?
My favourite venue in Birmingham, without question, is the town hall. I absolutely love the town hall. There are probably and I've performed at the town hall, which was a real privilege. There are probably venues where I preferred performing, if that makes sense. But I love everything about the town hall. So yeah,
it's got so much history as well. Like the
yeah,
Beatles performed there back in '64 or something, I think.
yeah.
So
I also saw Kano perform at the town hall, and that was epic.
wow. And finally, we ask everybody this. This is the Epic Brum podcast. So we always finish off by asking, and you've just used the word yourself, what makes Birmingham epic?
For me, there are a lot of things, but if I had to pick one thing, for me in particular, that if Birmingham lost it, I think I'd be lost in Birmingham. It's the canals. And people, we have the kind of back and forth of more canals in Venice. Yes, but it's not as pretty as Venice and all the back and forths. But for me, when I was at a loss for creativity, at a loss for identity in Birmingham, I would go and I would sit on a canal. I'd put my headphones on and play a hip hop beat, and I could write all day long. And there's just something, it's clearly very hyperbolic, but something magical about the canals of Birmingham. So that's what makes Birmingham epic for me.
Superb. Well, it is something we're really proud of, as you say, and to hear somebody put it like that and be inspired by it, it just kind of reinforces it. So, Casey, thank you very much for joining us on the Epic Brum podcast, and enjoy the rest of your busy half term.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for tuning in to the Epic Brum podcast. If you like what you heard, you can find more episodes on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever else you get your podcasts. And don't forget to follow us on social media at Epic Brum HQ.